first of all, I understand that the church has done this in the past, but not, we've been going, my wife and I, for 4 years here. And I just really want to thank Marge and her committee for coming up with the idea, because I've been to all but 2 of these, and I've just been blessed by every one that I've been at. And I hope there'll be something in here that you'll be blessed. Now, there was a scheduling snafu because you're having your 3rd consecutive week of an engineer talk. You gotta talk to Marge. And we've kind of gone, Paul's a civil engineer, Patty I'm not sure, but I'm guessing is an electrical engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer, so we're kind of going down the alphabet. Oh. Yeah. We'll see how long that lasts. Okay. I wanted to start this off with, if this was an AA meeting, I'd come up and say, hi, my name's Dennis, and I'm a perfectionist. Essentially, I'm a recovering perfectionist. And I thought I'd done a really good job until I lost my job of 25 years, and then we changed cities and changed jobs, and it was kind of like, oh no, you got some work to do on this perfectionism. But, let's see. I feel like I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, and I want you to know, being an engineer, I have complete documentation. So if I say something and it doesn't make any sense, if you're interested, I'm more than happy to share. Let's see. Okay. The first way I wanted to start this, these 131 words I think will make sense. I attended Steve Pierce Walk Across the Room class last October. And the idea is to put your faith story into 2 minutes. It's supposed to be 100 words. Mine started out at 260 words. And after 6 rewrites, I got it down to 131 words. But I can't go any shorter. So, so I'm going to start with this, and I hope the rest of my talk will address these points. I've always believed in Jesus as my Savior, but it was a head faith that expected life after death, but no new life in this world. In my mid-30s, I went through a year-long period of increasing depression. This led me to explore what my faith meant to me. I began focusing on what I thought Jesus wanted me to be doing at work and at home. I saw results from this new focus. 2 years later, over a 2-week period, I had several heightened spiritual connections with God. I knew that my life was changed forever. Today, I know I'm closer to living the life Jesus wants for me. When I catch myself doing something I know is God-led, there is no greater thrill in my life. So that's, hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, you should just leave the room, because the rest of it may be much more, much less sense. So I'm going to first just give a general background. Jerry, I think his was the first week he'd shared about what a near-perfect childhood he had in a small town in Indiana. Weiglu grew up in a mid-sized industrial town in Michigan, Flint, Michigan. Almost everything there was General Motors. You either worked for General Motors, you had a supplier for General Motors, or you were a teacher teaching kids from General Motors. And it was really a great place to grow up. He was born in 1952, and I promised Sam one jab. As a history teacher, I know, 1952 was a glorious year. The Republicans wrested the White House away from the Democrats after 20 long years. So it was a good year to be born. I wanted to share traits that and all of you have had kids. I'm sure you see your kids, they require some of your traits. Unfortunately, maybe not the ones you want them to acquire. And so I thought about my mom and dad. I just had a great childhood. And I can't imagine it having been any better. So I thought of the traits I see that I've acquired in my life from my mom and dad. From my mom, it was absolute honesty. We were just raised to be honest. My mom and I do this often at the expense of lack of diplomacy. So one of the things I've gotten a little better at is speaking the truth in love. But you're always going to get what I believe. It could be wrong, it's often wrong, but it is going to be what I believe. And then faith in God. My mom wasn't one that talked that much about her faith. I mean, we went to church every Sunday. We did try to do devotions, very much like I tried to do with my kids. It was kind of hit or miss. But just seeing her live her faith, hearing about her mother and my other grandmother, I mean, it was just a great example to grow up in. And then she's enthusiastic. I've been told I can be enthusiastic. And she loves to ham it up. She's not a shrinking violet. And I've also been told that I have those characteristics. Traits from my dad was a single track focus ability. All you women who are married to men know men tend to specialize in single track devotion, but my dad was just really good at, once he's going to do something, he just sets his sight at it and he just starts plugging away until he accomplishes it. I also, just from a young age, I've learned so much from my family, my two brothers and sister, my parents, just from observing what they do. But he always treated people with respect and fairly. It could be a store clerk, maybe there has been something all screwed up and he's gone to the store clerk, but he always treated him with respect. It wasn't pound the desk, give me my rights. It was always respect. And hopefully I do that at least most of the time. And he had a great interest in music, especially jazz and big band. He kind of encouraged me. He had gone to a technical high school in Flint, Michigan in the late 30s, early 40s. And they just had a small instrument. In your lunch hour, if you wanted to play, he played a clarinet. And he just kind of got me interested in music. I played a trombone from 4th grade through 12th grade. I was in the jazz band, and I love big band. In fact, in the 60s, everyone was listening to the Beatles. I was listening to Glenn Miller. And moving right along, one of the great things I acquired from my dad was a love of baseball. And I just love it. And actually, I'm going to talk about it, and many of you may not see how that relates to my faith story, but in my mind it does. There are a couple of great baseball writers who've written books on baseball. Roger Angel and Roger Kahn, and I'm not sure which one wrote this, but in high school I remember reading that if a Martian came down to Earth, picked up a baseball, he would know it was meant to be thrown. There's just something about the size of a baseball that you'd want to throw it. So that's prop number one. By the way, I've taught children in Sunday school for 15 years, so I don't speak without props. So. Okay, my siblings, I had two older brothers. My oldest brother was 4.5 years older than me, and my middle brother was 2 years older than me, and my sister was 2 years younger than me. And one of the things my parents are most proud about is we all get along even to this day. We don't, it's the kind of family that if you need help, you can ask for it. We don't do a whole lot of talking. I guess my mom was German. I guess it may be the German. But, we're very supportive of each other. Okay, so that's 2 pages, only 75 more, no. Okay, so I've had 3 great passions in my life. And I want to discuss my story based on those 3 passions. You may have guessed it. Passion number 1 was baseball. This is roughly the order I had these passions in. And to me, they all really do relate. You may not see that, but in my mind, and that's all that it's important, it does relate. Second one is being a husband and a father. I've had a passion for that even before I met my wife. And then spiritual faith understandings. So I'm going to go in baseball. Now I'm going to start with the great movie Chariots of Fire. I don't know how many of you remember this, but it's basically written 1924 Olympics from the British track team's perspective. And they were going against the heavily favored American team. And Eric Liddell he was born, his parents were missionary in China, he was born in China. I think he spent most of his first 15, 16 years in China, then he went to England. Well, he was the favored runner in the 100-yard dash. And the movie just does an excellent job. It was made by a British company. I think it was very low budget. No one expected it to be that popular. But if you want to borrow the film or rent it, I highly recommend it. But one of the lines that Eric used, his sister was concerned he was getting too much into track and not enough about being a missionary. He ended up going back to China, served there for years, actually died in a Japanese internment camp in 1944. But one of the lines that he used that I first came across when I was teaching Sunday school that just really explained to me my passion for baseball was he told his sister, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." And I've come to believe that anything you really are passionate about, God has given you that as a gift, and baseball was one of them. Our church in Michigan, we sponsored some major leaguers coming to share their faith with kids. I mean, it was just like really neat. But just I've learned so many lessons, first in baseball, that I've applied to my life. And I just love that quote. Okay, prop number 2. Lessons I learned from my dad. He was in World War II in the Army. Luckily, he got to Europe after the Normandy invasion. He landed in Europe at the end of November 1944, and his unit moved to the front line just at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. He was not in the fighting, but he said, "We complained for a week because we got no mail." And it turned out they were surrounded by Germans. Would have been wiped out if the Germans were interested, but they weren't. Well, after the war, he stayed there till February or March of 1946, and the Army had all these men in Europe. The war was over, so what did they do? They built baseball fields. My dad said we had surveying equipment. We set 90 degrees, we leveled the field, we set baseball fields. He was the only pitcher in his company, and he pitched baseball and softball. He said, "I left my arm in Germany." Sometimes he pitched baseball and softball the same day. He once pitched a doubleheader. His lieutenant had bet $200 on the game with the other company's lieutenant, and they won, so he made his lieutenant happy. But at 6 years old, I mean, I just spent hours with him, and he'd been in the Army with a major league pitcher, and for me it was like major league pitcher. And he just taught me how to pitch. I mean, here's the rubber, you'll wind up, and I mean, I'm just practicing this all the time. We went to the state park in Michigan. We always spent 2 weeks in upper, lower Michigan. I know you Illinois think of Michigan as the Upper Peninsula, but we pretty much ignore the Upper Peninsula. For us, upper northern Michigan is the Traverse City area. And apparently my form was so good at 6 and 7, people would just stop and watch me pitch. My baseball abilities really peaked about 12 years old. After that, they kind of leveled off. And I was just so proud of that. He also taught me how to judge fly balls. And I was proud of that. I never dropped a pop-up in my life till 9th grade. I did that with a bases loaded and 3 runs scored. After that, I was a little less sure of myself. But up till 9th grade, I never had a doubt. And to me, that's something about faith. Now, my brother, who was 4.5 years older, he taught me about hitting. And I still, to this day, in fact, I got this, my hero was Mickey Mantle. I got this last year. I shouldn't have because it cost $75. Dennis McRitch. So I have my own autographed baseball bat. But my brother taught me, and I would spend hours in front of the mirror in high school just practicing my swing. Before my senior year, he was a junior high coach in basketball north of Flint. And I'd go out on Sundays, he'd throw me rubber balls in the gym just for me to practice. And of course, with all that practice, I couldn't fail. Well, I went 0 for 14 my senior year, got set down on the bench. 4 games later, the other guy got sick, and I got my chance, and I hit the rest of the way. So, so I was lucky there. But I just learned about perseverance, hard work, and I wasn't a perfectionist in baseball for some reason. I played basketball. I didn't have the confidence I'd make a mistake. I'd kind of hide on the court. In baseball, if I made an error, if I struck out, that didn't happen often. But it was just me, what do I got to do to get better? And I just keep working at it. And then I had a great high school coach. 11th and 12th grade, we moved to Grand Blanc. He just loved baseball. So when I taught my son, coached my son, or helped coach 7 years growing up. And I was a combination of my dad, my brother, and my high school coach. And just the love from father to son, and then me passing it on to my son. Very spiritual connotations for at least me. And the last thing I'd like to say about baseball, and then I'll move on. But I believe in baseball, I achieved as close to 100% of my potential as in any other area of my life. I mean, I was a above average player, didn't replace Mickey Mantle in center field for the Yankees. That was my dream, but it didn't happen. But I really believed for what God gave me for talent, I came really close to matching that. And when I think about that, it inspires me to go, God, help me to do that in the other areas of my life. Okay, now we'll move on to me being a husband. And basically from 9th grade, that's when my friends started getting interested in girls and started dating. And I was interested in girls, but I was really, really shy. And I had really from 9th grade through the end of my junior year in college, I had this real deep longing to meet a girl, to be able to date someone and eventually marry. And September of 1973, went to the University of Michigan, by the way, a far better sports school than Purdue or Illinois or anything. Okay, Jerry, you can heckle me once.
I'll let Carl.
And this is going to lose something, but if I was in Michigan, and I said my freshman year in college was the second year of the great Bo Schembechler's reign at Michigan, and my one claim to sporting fame in my 5 years at the University of Michigan was our co-ed football team won the first 2 championships in the history of U of M intramural sports. Applause? So I always say I met Trish on a football field, but it was actually a softball field because we played co-ed softball the month before we played co-ed football. And there's actually 2 marriages out of that. We basically had 4 men, 4 women. You played 3 men and 3 women in football, and there were 2 marriages out of that small team. So it did something. Unfortunately, once I get a goal in mind, I can sometimes be a little overly tenacious. So I met Trish in September 1973. In the spring of 1974, Trish said, I don't think so. And she broke off her relationship. And here again, I believe God had his hand in me, that I was kind of torn between, should I go after a master's degree or should I accept a job? And I interviewed my senior year, and if I would have accepted a job, it would have been working for a textile company in North Carolina. But this was in the midst of the oil embargo. 1973 was kind of, and my dad worked for GM his whole career. Well, GM gave me a full ride scholarship to the master's program. And my dad's going, I don't believe this. You know, they're laying people off, they're doing this, they're doing that. So I stayed. And in the fall of 1974, Trish had a great awakening. And I think it had something to do with me being a little more laid back. So we dated October through December, and then she had this silly idea of going off with her 2 roommates to England to student teach for 6 months. And so I had a 7-day break between my end of the winter term, and we had to get a master's at Michigan. It's only 30 hours, so I had to go to 2 months of the spring term, taking classes at double the schedule. And I had like $800 in the bank account, and it was $700 to fly to England, so I flew to England. And we had a good time touring through England, just some great sights. And I came back kind of a week late, and we were going to have a test the next week, and I was in a math class that I still to this day don't know what it was about. It was a really weird math class, but I survived it somehow. So I accepted my first job. I graduated in June of '75. I accepted my first job in Cleveland, Ohio for Union Carbide at their Carbon Products Division R&D Center in Parma, Ohio, which at that time, the Ghoul on Channel 50 came from Parma, Ohio. It was a late night movie thing, and this guy was all dressed up like a ghoul. So my friends were really impressed that I was working in Parma, Ohio. And Trish was entering her senior year, so for every weekend actually I started in late July, so really August of '75 through May of '76, every weekend Dennis traveled back to Michigan. Heil Turnpike between Cleveland and Toledo, 110 miles, 3 service plazas. I knew every mile on that turnpike. That was another 40 miles to get to Ann Arbor. And that's where I started making my famous apple pie and chocolate chip cookies, because I was staying with her 2 roommates and her, and I figured I had to pay my way. So I always baked an apple pie and chocolate chip cookies. They were happy. Things were simpler back then. Trish graduated May 1st, 1976. We were married June 5th, 1976, just a month short of our nation's 200th anniversary. I think that's important somehow. But our first 3 years of married life, we were in Cleveland, and then I decided I really wanted to look for another job, and we thought we're going to look in Michigan. I got a job in Troy, Michigan. We lived there 26 years. And so today, I can say my spiritual faith lessons, which I haven't got into, but I will get into it. I did abbreviate it, because this has taken longer than I thought, so I'm glad I did abbreviate it. But again, any questions you got, I got documentation, or you can stay afterwards. But after 22 years, I had basically in my walk across the room, I mentioned mid-30s, 1935, a year-long depression. That's where I really started questioning my faith. I mean, that was my great awakening, that God was really interested in a day-to-day relationship. He really wanted me to be following. It wasn't just life after death. It was life every day. And I know I've become a much better husband. I mean, before that time, if you would have asked me, and probably Trish, she would have said, "You're okay." But and we've been married 33 years, well, the last 8 years especially. I mean, we're getting the marriage thing right. And I hope our kids don't take that long. And this is the thing I'm most proud about, and I have the highest value in my life, that Trish trusts me implicitly. I mean, she just trusts me. And I pray relatively often is, "Lord, help me not to screw that up." And my son was married 2 years ago, and it was an outdoor at a state park, and everyone that wanted to talk could talk. So her father and I talked a lot about our faith. You know, I didn't even know her father, but he has a very strong faith. And I was able at that time to very honestly say the best decision in my life was when I married my wife. And, you know, hopefully my son will be able to say the same. Being a father, I loved it when they were growing up, and I love it now. My son was born May 10th, 1981 on Mother's Day. Unfortunately, he takes too much after his father. He was a breech baby, and Chris spent 12 hours in the delivery room in a lot of pain. And I just recall the mixed feelings. I mean, you're expecting this new life and all this pain, and it's kind of like, what's going on here? And the unsurpassed joy of witnessing the miracle of birth. I mean, especially the first child. I mean, there's nothing that can top that. And the realization that Trish and I only had God to thank that He gave us a healthy baby. I mean, we could have been the richest people in the world, but the health of your baby, I mean, that's out of your hands. And I remember waiting for a year and a half or so. I could not wait for the first conversation with my son. It was just like that thought was just like, wow. My daughter now sometimes, no. My daughter was born 2 years later, October 22nd, 1983. She, having to be different than her brother, popped out in 30 minutes. We went to the hospital at 11:30. I took Trish up to whatever they call the room. It's not the delivery room, but the waiting room, I guess. And they said, "Well, you got to go down and register." So I went down to get registered. It's late at night, 11:30. So I'm walking up the stairwell. I get to this back to where Trish is, and the door's locked, apparently for security. There's like no one walking around. I'm pounding the door, let me in, let me in. Someone finally came and let me in. So I was there for my daughter's birth, but it was nip and tuck. And she gave Trish the girl she was expecting. But when her son was born, and Trish saw it was a boy, it was just like, not that she had anything against boys, but she was just sure it was going to be a girl. I only really have 3 regrets as a father. Not that I was perfect, but when I sit back and think about my regrets, it was after Anna's birth. I didn't realize how much extra attention and help Trish really needed from me for those first several months. And like she says, she didn't really communicate it to me, but I still regret that I wasn't somehow more aware that she needed my help more. Second big regret is this adolescence thing I had no idea was coming. I mean, just absolutely nothing. It's like, here's this reasonable son I'm raising. Oh, we're playing baseball, we're doing this. And I wish I would have had some preparation in that area. And much of the time when our children were growing up, I crossed up my family priorities. I knew my family was important, but I put my kids ahead of my wife. And it really should be the other way around. And I'm doing a much better job at that. But if I had to start over again, it would be wife and then kids. Okay, now spiritual understanding. We'll do this quick. I'm really glad I shortened it because I could tell it's going to be pretty long. This is my basic background information. We grew up Missouri Lutheran, and we attended church and Sunday school every week. And I really feel blessed that I was growing up Missouri Lutheran because my wife grew up Catholic. And for me, one of the big differences between the Lutheran church and the Catholic church is Lutherans grow up believing this is God's word. This is truth. If there's a difference between what man's doing and what the Bible says, this is your reference. And especially back in the 50s and even the early 60s, the Catholics really don't have that down. I mean, it's the Pope and what the organization says. And I just am so thankful that God chose to send me into a really Bible-based church. Early Sunday school lessons that I learned. First one is, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And the second one is, I'm a sinner, saved only by the faith in Jesus' death on the cross. And the last 22 years, I've just spent a lot more time, and I just love studying the Bible, going to small groups, going to seminars. But to me, I read Paul a lot, and those are just the two truths that Paul just keeps pounding in. And to me, that's one of the miracles, really, of the Christian faith as a 4 or 5-year-old can capture all the basics. And that's one of the reasons I taught children's Sunday school for 15 years at my old church, because I just remembered what an effect it had on me. My last memory he was a 4th or 5th grade Sunday school teacher. This guy was not a brilliant scholar. I'm sure he was a line worker in an auto plant. And I just remember, just like it was last year, talking about Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. That garden, that was near Jerusalem. But just how when he's praying at the cross, if it's possible, take this cross from me, but not your will, but not, well, you know the verse, not my will, but your will be done. I mean, that teacher made that so real and Jesus so human that it was a great memory. We had 7th and 8th grade confirmation class on Saturdays. I didn't go to parochial school. My two older brothers went, and I consider myself saved because I played a trombone, and my dad had interest in music. They didn't have music, so he talked my mom into avoiding that. So I've learned, my Bible reading has come from my Bible reading, not from learning it when I was a young kid. But there were not obvious effects going to 2 years of confirmation. But God did manage to plant a few scriptures in my head, and the two that popped out at me were 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. It really did. I just remember going, wow, that's a neat thought. But it's God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. That just really meant a lot. And without even knowing about when I went through, I'm going to talk about 3 crises I've had in my life. I mean, that was at the root of it. Not that I was reading that verse, but that was at the root of it. And the other one was 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Well, in junior high, it wasn't really the love part that got me. It was this clanging gong, the resounding gong or clanging cymbal. I thought, that's a weird example. But, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is very meaningful for me. When I talked at my son's wedding, I gave him a thing I had made up with love is patient, love is kind, all the things that are difficult to do in a marriage, but that God wants us to do. And the last thing I remember from junior high is our vicar who taught confirmation. He was the guy going through seminary, and he had to spend 1 year at a church. Don't ever start dating a Catholic girl. It will only lead to trouble. 2 out of 3 is not bad. I got 2 Bible verses. High school, I had very limited involvement with the youth group. I did do a few things, but not very much. I went to church every Sunday. And in college, during the school year, my claim to religious pursuit was I took the bus from North Campus in Michigan into Central Campus and walked a mile to the Lutheran Chapel 5 times in the first 2 years. I went a few times, but it wasn't that important to me. I wasn't rejecting my faith. It was just like, gee, that's a lot of work on a Sunday. During the summer, we went to church every Sunday. Our early marriage years occasionally attended the Lutheran or Catholic church, but it wasn't that big of a thing. We just went once in a while. When Trish was pregnant with our first son, that's when we realized new life is coming into the world. We're going to be responsible. We can't handle that on our own. And that's when we started going to church regularly. We started reading the Bible, and it was like, I know these stories. From being a child in Sunday school, learning those stories, it was like, I know these stories. And that's where I first had my appetite whetted. Okay. I'm going to wrap this up in 5 minutes, I promise. I had 3 major life crises when I was 35, 1986, then 9 years later, 1995, and 9 years later, 2004. And so I kind of thought now from the similarities and differences in these crises, and especially my first one, that was the one that really changed my life and my relationship with God. I've got a 12-page letter I wrote to my family and friends. If you are interested in reading, I'd love to give you a copy. But the similarities in these 3 crises were each lasted a long time. I don't believe in a short-term crisis. If I'm going to have a life crisis, I want it to last. They range from 7 months to 2 years. Each involved long periods of little or no sleep and some level of depression. The first one, the largest depression. Each were 9 years apart, so I'm kind of wondering what's in store for me in 2013. And each taught me valuable things about my faith and my life. 1986, the differences were, as I mentioned in my walk across the room, that was the turning point in my life. Up till then, I had a head faith. I know I'm going to be in heaven at the end of my life, but this concept of a personal daily walk with God had never reached home. It led me to deeply examine my life. I'm a Christian, what's that all about? My mom had taught us to be honest without, just honesty. And I started asking myself, if I'm being honest, and I'm in a world that is often not honest, I'm really a fool if I'm just being honest to be honest. But if I'm doing it because that's what my Lord and Savior wants me to be doing, that's a whole different aspect. So after 2 years, I basically wrote, my wife calls it my resignation letter in January of 1987. To me, it wasn't a resignation letter. It was a letter saying, well, my job has changed. It's requiring long hours, different skills, so I got to find a new job. My boss didn't get rid of me. And over the next 2 years, I started going to seminars, started reading the Bible. I just was overwhelmed with resources. One of the most important books for me was Catherine Marshall. She had actually died a couple years before I was having my crises, but Something More. And it was a book, my wife had borrowed it from my grandmother for Lent, and she didn't really find it that interesting. I started reading it, and almost from the first page, some of the things I'd heard before, but just really hadn't applied to me, and then others were totally different. But it just got to the point, well, I'm going to start trying this stuff out. And I was just amazed over those 2 years how things started working out better. And then 2 years later, January 5th, 1989, for 2 weeks, every time I prayed, I just was overcome. I gotta say it was the Holy Spirit, no voices, but it was just like, I just felt power, had all these thoughts coming through. I wrote a lot of them down, but to me it was kind of giving me a blueprint of how I'm supposed to live my life. Then 1995, this was 9 years later, I worked at our R&D facility, we had a new director, and he needed a new group leader. And he had talked with everyone. He said, Dennis, I'd like you to lead this group. And I spent 2 hours telling him why I shouldn't be the group leader. I'm doing this software controls engineering, it's really important, 2 hours. And he said, well, think about it. In the next 2 days, I'm just again thinking and praying. I'm thinking, God really wants me to take this position. And so I did. And for the first 3 months, loved it. It was just like, oh God, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And then the next 7 months, it was just torment. And after a couple of months, I went to my boss, said, I don't think I can handle this. He said, wait till the end of the year. Give it a chance. You're new to the job. And it just got worse and worse. And when January came around, I had a 2-week vacation. Usually I come back all refreshed. Not this time. And so one morning, Trish tells me, she says, Dennis, you just got to go and tell your boss, you got to get out of this job. So I go to work and I tell him. He says, okay. I get back that night. Trish says, what did he say? I can't believe I told you that. Well, what he said was, okay, I'll put you back in your old job because there was this important project that had to get completed, but you won't be able to stay there. And you got a pretty big raise when 3 months into being a group leader, they gave me a good raise because I was doing such a great job. You won't have that raise. Well, he was wrong. I stayed in that position for 9 more years till I lost my job. And they never took my pay raise away from me. So I felt that was God's hand in there. And wrapping it up, I promise. 2004, May 31st, I'd worked at my job for 25 years. I was our only software controls engineer. I was the best of the best. There was only one of me. I like that. It was good for self-image. We had been bought 2 years earlier by a large Swedish company that did the same work, and they had their own systems that I did the control systems with. And I knew there was a possibility I was going to lose my job because of this. And so I had 2 months warning. And March 31st, they told me, you're going to be losing your job in 2 years, but we're hoping you can support the equipment. You have the controls down in South Carolina. At one point, it looked like that was going to work out. It didn't. So May 31st, they gave me my 25-year watch and my traveling papers. So what I did there is I pretty much all along had felt I didn't want to work long hours. I mean, I really felt I'd gone to a seminar where the guy just really pounded that in. And so I don't always work a 40-hour week, but I rarely work more than 45 hours. But that was always, until my first crisis, that was always an issue. But then it was like, nope, I'm going to do that. And if the company doesn't like it, then it's time for me to move on. Well, so I was looking for a job where I didn't have to work much more than 40 hours. And also I didn't want to travel more than a month a year because I'd only traveled 1 or 2 weeks a year, and I don't do well traveling. I like routine. I'm an engineer. Don't give me new things. So we started looking. Our daughter was also a senior in college at Western Michigan, so we wanted to stay in the Detroit area. So for that year I looked. There were a few job possibilities, but they all involved long hours or a lot of travel. And after 6 months unemployment, I was kind of paying attention to our savings because I didn't want to be too just all about me and what about my wife. But the savings never dropped. They all stayed the same. The 6 months unemployment ran out, and then all of a sudden my old company up in West Branch, Michigan, 3 hours away, I'd done one system for them. They needed my help. Well, they paid me twice as much as they used to pay me. And again, my savings never went down. In May of 2005, there was a job. It was at a Chrysler auto plant that coincidentally last year was closed, but it was 6 miles from my home. And it was going to work second shift. Wasn't wild about that, but it would be a higher stress job because it would be supporting the production lines, the computer software on it. So I talked with my dad, my brother, and a friend of mine who'd worked for the auto companies. 2 out of the 3 said, I think you should take it. Doesn't mean you got to stay there. So at night I said, I'm going to stay. I'm going to call tomorrow morning, accept the job. From that moment, I was not at peace. It was just like, boom. All night, I'm not at peace. The next morning, I said, nope. But for me, it was God saying, this isn't the job I want you in. This was a year after being unemployed. So I called and said, I'm not going to take it. Well, that same day on the internet, Monster.com, I see an advertisement for a company in Chicago area. And I told my wife after a year, that's the first job that's almost exactly like what I've done. So I emailed back. It was a blind response. I didn't know who it was. The manager calls me on a Thursday and says, talk to 10 minutes, says, I'd really like you to come down to Chicago. So I'm thinking, yeah, next week. So I said, well, when do you want me? He said, what about tomorrow? So my wife was working late. She comes home and says, you want to go to Chicago tomorrow? So we went, interviewed, they said, we want to really need this job filled, hope to make a decision the next week. Well, the next week they offered me the job, so we put our house up for sale. All this time I hadn't been working on the house because I hadn't been planning on leaving. It was a fairly slow market, not as slow as it is now in Michigan. I mean, if you guys think it's bad here, go to Michigan. A real estate agent from church, he was in a small group I was in, an older guy that I really trusted. He said, you probably get 5-6 people a week to look at your house. Well, we sold the house in 10 days. We had like 25 people come through. One couple kept coming back 4 times in a row. They finally made the offer. It was like $8,000 below what we were asking. And they had some conditions that I didn't like, and it would have been an issue between Trish and I, because some of the stuff he was saying, it was like, well, so our real estate agent is going to bring the offer over, and when he gets there, he says, the weirdest thing just happened. This couple drove by, saw your house, they want to look at the house before I present you the offer. So they looked at the house, they offered us $100 more than we were asking. I didn't plan that. I really feel God was moving here. The next day we were going to Illinois to look for houses because I got the job. So on June 2nd, my wife's birthday, we bought our house in Illinois. We closed June 30th. We moved into the house July 1st. So in 6 weeks, I found a new job, sold our old house, bought a new house, and moved in. I thought, this is great. Well, this was my 2-year high stress period. I thought I'd really overcome my perfectionism. I had confidence I could do a good control. Well, there are a lot of other control people. I'm not the best one here. These guys are better than I am. So God was teaching me a lot more. And essentially that next year was extremely stressful. And really what I found in those 2-year periods, the first year when I was having sleepless nights, which I'd always had in my 3 crises, I found out the gift of occasional anti-anxiety pills to help you get sleep. Well, the second year, it led to a fairly low dose of an antidepressant drug. And I mean, that made a tremendous difference. And in closing, we came here in September of 2005 after we'd been here for a couple of months, and we were just the love of this church. We were just attracted to it, and I mean, especially the first year, but now we just appreciate our relationships here. So that's my talk. Yeah, I mean, you guys can leave first, and then if anyone's got questions. Yes.
What company are you
UOP.
with?
It's a company, we sell technology to the oil refineries. So up until last September, oh, it was great. Go up, yes. Go up. Gotta buy more stuff.
You're in agreement.
No, we're only supporting. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks for listening. I really enjoyed doing my talk.